Now, our first dip into Luke's Gospel is in a chapter which begins with the words Jesus said to his disciples. And it gathers together a number of themes. Those short introductory words are similar to others in chapter 12, 13 and 16. It's a regular way of introducing. And Luke's Gospel has particular themes. And I want to read, if I can, for you from Luke 17, verses 5 through to 10. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." He replied, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it will obey you. Suppose one of you has a servant ploughing or looking after the sheep. Will he say to the servant when he comes in from the field, 'Come along now and sit down to eat'? Won't he rather say, 'Prepare my supper, get yourself ready, and wait on me while I eat and drink? After that you may eat and drink'? Will he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you've done everything you were told to do, should say, 'We are unworthy servants. We've only done our duty.'" Now, this is a fascinating passage. You could get it wrong, really. Jesus is not affirming that people should all be servants, but he is saying that just as a servant would do that, so are we servants. And we are people who know what it is to serve. Now, there are two aspects that I draw your attention to. Firstly, increase our faith. This is a great Lucan theme, this faith and spirit and prayer. Increase our faith. And the Lord's demands upon the disciples seemed enormous. And the only way they could begin to measure up would be if God increased their faith. They knew that by themselves they could not achieve all that had to be done. Jesus tells them it's not the size of their faith that matters, but what they do with it. And so it is that you have that verse 6 that is very challenging. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to the mulberry tree, "Be uprooted and planted in the sea," and it will obey you. As small as a mustard seed. Faith in that way. And then the other aspect that I draw your attention to is this pathway to duty. Now, these words sort of seem out of vogue today. The concept of servanthood is not an easy one. We at Wesley Mission kept servanthood as something that we believed was important. But it's not any model of servanthood. It's not just any kind of model. It's not the old-fashioned slave servanthood. It is servanthood in the sense of servanthood of God and knowing what it is to relate to him. We are bound by obligations, by virtue of our calling. Because we are disciples, so we do. Because we are called, so we act. Put simply, because of our faith, we are to keep our allegiance to God and all that flows from it. Now, we're not expecting recognition or thanks, but we're responding to God's love and grace, which is why we have this little cameo story about a servant coming in and then concluding, we are unworthy servants. We've only done our duty. You can imagine that being read within the early community. That's one way of reading the Gospels, of saying, what is it about the Gospel stories that is significant? What message do they have to communicate to us? And in the life of the early church, there must have been those asking questions about what they do and why they do it and what it's worth. And they are just unworthy servants, all of us, Luke included, adding that thought that's there. And the way Jesus tells the story reminds us of the sense of obligation that's ours. Now, it's a holy obligation, not a forced obligation. There are some patterns of obligation which are there saying, you will do this because I tell you. Well, it's not that. It's because God's love is real. We have taken upon ourselves that obligation which is holy to live out our life of faith and witness and service in the community. Just in the same way that Paul shared with us that at Newcastle, they do the work that they do in all those different services, providing something like 27 different services with 50 staff and endless volunteers, because somehow God has called them to do it. And now they may not always be aware of a direct line in which God is saying, you must do this. But there's an obligation that goes with the Christian faith to do whatever it is that God is calling us to do. Now, the disciples had to learn that, members of the early church had to learn that, and we have to learn it again and again. And yet there's a joy in service. There is no greater joy on earth than to know that you do the will of God, to know that somehow God in his grace, in his love, in his mercy, calls us to a purpose. And when we fulfill that purpose, when we enter in to what that purpose means, to what that calling is all about, gosh, how we are changed. Not only is the world changed by what we do, but we who are disciples of Jesus, we who are followers of Jesus, we're changed as well, because we're sharing it. We might be unworthy. We might be those people who are not up to the task in ourselves, but God's grace. Grace is the great word of the Christian faith. It's a gigantic word that we cannot cast aside. The unmerited, unearned love of God. And that unearned, unmerited love is something that reaches out through us into our community, into a community where so many people feel that they don't count and they don't matter, but they do. And we will share that love as unworthy servants.